So welcome to this presentation from the Urban Penguin. We're going to take a look at different ways that we can install Ansible to decide which one is best. My name is Andrew Mallett and I am the Urban Penguin. In this video, we'll be working entirely with Rocky Linux 9.4 and investigating different ways that we can install Ansible. Now, the first method that we're going to use is probably the most simple method, where we look at installing it from the EPEL repository. Come on, let's find that command line. Aha, I found it already. Here we are. But what did you say? I thought you said we were using Rocky Linux 9.4. Well, we are. Let me just bring the virtual machine up. We're going to be using the same virtual machine, but just destroying it after each attempt, so we know we're not leaving anything behind. So I'm just firing up the virtual machine. It will fire up into VirtualBox, but we're just using the Vagrant Virtual Machine Manager, which makes life so convenient. So you can see we're just firing up at the moment, and we're waiting for SSH to become available, and we're going to be then adding the correct keys. So that's then working nicely for us, and we are up and running. So I can just use the command vagrant space SSH to connect into the virtual machine. Again, just the simplicity of using vagrant, so I don't have to worry about the IP address. Looking at my hostname CTL, we can now see that we are running Rocky Linux 9.4 and we're virtualized inside a VirtualBox. When we look at using DNF or yum, and if I just run the repo list, we can see I already have the extra products for Enterprise Linux repo installed. So we can then go straight ahead and use yum install -y and Ansible. And as I say, this is probably the most simple way to install Ansible. But as we'll look at different ways, we'll find out it's not necessarily the best. We're going to get Ansible version 2.14 from this. And there are later versions that are available. So you can see it's coming down. It won't take that long. We'll leave this running, but I won't keep you waiting for every full install. So the packages are down now. We're just running through the installation, and we should be back out at our command line any moment. And as I say, we can see if we look carefully on the screen what is being installed, but we're going to run the Ansible ---- version command once it has installed. And there you go. It has installed. We are ready to go, and I can run the Ansible command with ---- version. And you can see, well, we're 2.14.14. So it's okay, but not necessarily the most recent, but it's going to cater for a lot of circumstance. So I can then exit, and then I can use my vagrant destroy -f to delete the virtual machine. Next up, we can look at using the Python installer pip. Ansible really is an entirely Python product, so this can be a mechanism to install Ansible. So as we then go through and bring our virtual machine back up, remember we destroyed it before, so this is a brand new virtual machine that we are creating. But don't worry, we don't have to wait for the complete boot process. So we can now just go through and run our vagrant SSH, and we're back into our virtual machine, but it is completely fresh. It doesn't have Ansible installed. So I can then run sudo and pip install, and we can then go through and put Ansible. Now this is a mechanism that is going to work, but we'll see at the end there will be a warning that we really shouldn't be installing Python modules with pip as root. So you can see the warning at the bottom of the page there. We can break Python. We can create a virtual environment to make this happen, but then it's only going to be available for my user account when I'm in that virtual environment. So it's not quite as convenient. But in any case, let's see what they delivered us. So if I now go through and run Ansible ---- version, we can see then that we've got 2.15.12. So it's a later version than was available from EPEL. So this might be good, but we've just got the concerns that might be there where we used pip as root to run the installation. But anyway, let's exit out and destroy our virtual machine and look at the third mechanism. The third way that we're going to look at, and probably not so well known, is installing from Git. Not exactly source code, because this is Python we're talking about, but let's look at how we can do this. So we can go back and bring our virtual machine back up. As we said before, this is a completely fresh virtual machine, and then we can log into it via SSH. I do need to make sure that I've got the Python development package on, so I'm just going to quickly install this. So yum install -y python 3-devel, and we can allow that to run through, but it's very quickly installed. Now if we go through and clone the Ansible repository, so going out to https://github.com and looking in the Ansible and Ansible repository, and if we clone this, now this will take a while to clone, so I have cut a little bit out. Probably going to take 2 or 3 minutes to come down depending on your network speed, but we can cut a little bit of it out to make it run through a little bit quicker. And then once it has come down, of course, we can move into the Ansible directory. So we cloned it into our home directory, so it's going to be called Ansible. So this is the root of our repository. And if I use git branch -r to list the remote branches, we can see all of the versions that we have. As we scroll through, we can see, well, perhaps the latest, if we don't want the development branch, is stable-2.17. So we could try that. So if we go through and switch to the branch stable-2.17, then of course we're looking at all of that code. And with Python code, we normally have a setup file to run. So I can then run Python 3 setup.py and install. Now running through, it will have to put some dependency modules on, so we can allow this to happen. It will run through relatively quick because the main core code now is downloaded in the repository. So that's now installed. But look what happens when we try and run our Ansible version. We're getting an error where it's saying that it requires a later version of Python than we have. 3.10 is required, and we've only got 3.9.18. So let's go through and switch. I'm going to switch to stable-215. I happen to know that 216 won't work on this version of Python either. So if we go to stable-215, I know that's what we got with pip, but we can then run through. Obviously, the dependency modules are already installed now, so we don't have to worry about installing those. And now when we look at our Ansible and version, we can see then that we've got 2.15.12. So that's pretty much the same version, but we do have the extra bit on the end post 0, but we're also not getting the warnings about having installed this with pip. So to get the latest version of Ansible that suits your version of Python, the best mechanism is probably getting it from Git. So in this video, we've seen that the simplest way to install Ansible on Rocky Linux 9.4 is to use the EPEL repository. If we want a later version, we can do a pip install using the Python installer, but we have to be aware that we might be damaging system components if we do that. The third way that we saw was then installing from the Git repository, but we have to make sure that we're installing a version that's going to be compatible with the version of Python that we have.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @the Urban Penguin.